Chapter 29, Section 4, Watergate Ends Nixon's Career. On June 17, 1972, 5 men broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee in Washington, D.C. A security guard at the Watergate building where the officers were located caught the men. But the burglars were unusual. They wore suits and carried bugging or wiretapping devices. Further investigation showed that they had ties to Nixon's re-election campaign. Early news reports of the break-in did not stop Nixon from winning the 1972 presidential election by a landslide. But the bungled burglary and attempts to cover it up would eventually lead to Nixon's fall from power. Abusing power to limit dissent. At first, the Watergate burglars' intentions were unclear. Their actions, however, were part of a larger pattern of abuse of presidential power. Nixon tended to view critics of his policies as a threat to national security. Once elected, he developed an enemies list that included reporters, politicians, activists, and celebrities, whom he viewed as being unfriendly to his administration. He authorized the FBI to tap the phones of news reporters whom he felt were biased against him. He even ordered phone tapping of members of his own staff whom he distrusted. All these wiretaps were unconstitutional, and thus an abuse of power because a judge had not properly authorized them. The president also showed grave concerns for secrecy. He set up his own White House security operation to investigate leaks of damaging information to the press. The group received the nickname the Plumbers because their main job was to plug leaks. In 1971, the Plumbers had broken into the office of a psychiatrist whose clients included Daniel Ellsberg, a former defense analyst. Nixon had suspected Ellsberg of leaking the Pentagon Papers, a set of secret military documents on the Vietnam War, to the New York Times. A year later, it was the White House plumbers who carried out the botched Watergate burglary. The Watergate scandal unfolds. The break-in might have been forgotten after Nixon's re-election if not for the work of 2 Washington Post reporters. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein would not let the matter drop. With the help of an anonymous source whom they called Deep Throat, they discovered that Nixon's re-election campaign had paid the plumbers to bug the Democrats' offices. More details came out when the plumbers faced trial in 1973. During the legal proceedings, one of them implicated the Nixon administration in a cover-up. He reported that the defendants had been paid to lie to protect government officials. At this point, what the White House had tried to dismiss as a third-rate burglary had turned into the Watergate scandal. Pressure to thoroughly investigate the scandal increased. The Justice Department appointed Archibald Cox, a respected law professor, to serve as special prosecutor in the case. A special prosecutor is a lawyer from outside the government whom the Attorney General or Congress appoints to investigate a federal official for misconduct while in office. After the plumbers' trial, the Senate formed a committee to investigate the Watergate Affair. In televised hearings, former White House counsel John Dean testified that Nixon had been involved in efforts to cover up White House links to the Watergate break-in. Another former Nixon aide revealed that President Nixon had installed a recording system in the White House Oval Office that taped every conversation Nixon had there. If the committee could hear those tapes, it would find out whether the president had ordered a cover-up. In July 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee issued a subpoena, or court order, compelling Nixon to turn over several tapes. Nixon refused, invoking a right to withhold information known as executive privilege. The concept of executive privilege is based on the constitutional separation of powers. Presidents since George Washington's day have argued that separation of powers gives the executive branch the right to operate without having to reveal to the other branches the details of every conversation or working document. Over the next few months, Nixon battled both Special Prosecutor Cox and the Senate committee over the release of the White House tapes. In October 1973, in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon fired Cox. Nixon's own attorney general then resigned in protest. That same month, for reasons unrelated to Watergate, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned. He left office to avoid facing trial on charges of accepting bribes and evading taxes while governor of Maryland. Nixon appointed Gerald Ford, Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives, to be Agnew's successor as vice president. In July 1974, in the case of the United States v. Nixon, the Supreme Court ruled that the president must release his tapes to the Senate. Once released, the recordings proved beyond a doubt that he had ordered a Watergate cover-up. Nixon resigns in disgrace. Late in July, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. The articles accused him of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Rather than face trial and almost certain conviction in the Senate, Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974. On August 9th, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president. "Our Constitution works," Ford said. "Our long national nightmare is over." In September, Ford issued Nixon a presidential pardon. Ford hoped the pardon would help unify the country by putting the Watergate mess to rest. Instead, it aroused controversy. Some Americans wanted to see Nixon tried for his alleged crimes. Others preferred to move on from Watergate. Despite Ford's efforts to close this unhappy chapter of presidential history, the nation remained deeply disillusioned with political leadership.